Hello, everyone. This is Tripp. We are back. It is time. It's bond time, in fact. This is going to be a fun conversation because we get not just one, but two scholars, and not just any scholar tag team, but they're also partners, covenantal partners in the journey of life. So which as someone that was on staff with their spouse for 4 years is simultaneously fun and complicated. Um, so, but we've experienced the lecture, which is quite provocative. We got some amazing questions that people have sent in. But now, Jeff, when we started talking about this class, it was very important to you that one, we talk about the issue of Bonhoeffer and incarceration, and you were like, I gotta message Jenny right now. So maybe as a way of beginning some introductions to getting to know them both, you can share a bit about how you and Jenny first connected as nerds, and some of the unique things about her that as a, you said one of the, that as a scholar she has put her feet where her convictions are. So.
Well, thanks, Jenny. I don't remember the first time we met, but I'm going to go ahead and say that I suspect it was in an AAR session on Bonhoeffer at some point. And Jenny was friends with my other good friend, Lori Hale. And so we met there, and then our connections extended from there to Chapel Hill in Charlottesville, where Jenny was. But as I've sort of, in my retirement, distanced myself from AAR, Jenny has become the president of the International Bonhoeffer Society English Language section. And Jenny, are you president of the AAR group now as well?
No, I am. I was co-chair for a while, but no longer.
Okay, so you're able to jettison that. Jenny's also the writer of amazing books on Christian discipleship, Christianity in the world. I think at one point I read Radical Discipleship, Liturgical, yeah. I can't remember the subtitle, but I just remember it being beautifully written, and it was really a convicting read for me to think about my place in the world. And you have other books as well. The most recent is You Shall Not Condemn. Is that correct?
Yes.
So you have a story to tell, and you'll tell it later. And I'm going to, because I don't know Thomas as well, I'm going to let you introduce him as a scholar. And also you can let the audience know what you've been doing with your life in the last year, because I find that is a place where you have put your convictions to your feet, so to speak, and are in a new position now.
Well, I feel so on the spot to introduce Thomas. So Thomas Fabizak is my spouse. And let's see, we've been married for since 2018, September 2018. And I really am getting to an introduction of him. I won't just tell you my whole relationship history with him, but we met in a minivan on the way to a women's prison where I had formerly taught through Candler School of Theology, a theology certificate program under the vision and mentorship of Elizabeth Bounds, who's an Emory ethicist. And then Thomas had that role a couple years later. And I would continue, and still do continue, to see the students that are still at the prison. And so I went through Thomas, and we met. And then from there, got to know each other. So he should probably tell you more about his scholarship. It's ranged quite a bit. We're both religious studies PhDs. He's kind of had his hands in a number of pieces, and now he runs a college degree program through Life University in the same women's prison where we taught the theology program. He also is the co-executive director of the Georgia Coalition for Higher Ed in Prison, which he can speak to more articulately, but basically it's the work of bringing colleges and universities across Georgia into the work of higher ed in prison, and really just done amazing work of getting grants and producing more programs and opportunities for incarcerated people to have higher education. He graduated from Emory with his Ph.D. And that was a really bad introduction, but there you have it. What was the other question, Jeffrey?
Oh, I didn't have another. Oh,
Okay.
I'll have a question for you later, but not right now.
Thomas, do you want to add to that really bad introduction?
Well, we know you like him. You know, so.
Yeah, I didn't think it was bad at all. I thought you covered all the major points, honestly. You know, in terms of scholarship, I mean, the only thing I guess I could say is that, like, when I was doing my PhD work, I was writing about David Friedrich Strauss, and have come a far way from that. And in the last few years, of course, focused more on initially on higher ed and prison work, but then also now doing some work around moral injury in relation to prisons. So,
yeah. So one of the we like at the beginning to get to know the conversation with scholars, and since we have a tag team, one of the things y'all even just in meeting right in a van going to a prison, that is not the place scholars tend to meet. Like, it could have been at an AAR reception, right, when you're at the Guild, or you're speaking at the same thing, or in grad school. Maybe you could share a bit, each of you share a bit about your own story as a scholar and person of faith, but how you got into that space. Like, what were the kinds of questions and how you related to the tradition that brought you to be like a nerd wrestling with it, but also taking seriously the people for whom you're using your gifts.
Yeah, so, I mean, for me, the story begins as growing up conservative evangelical, and taking my faith very seriously from the start, and being sort of immersed in that environment all the way through high school, and then even into college, and then becoming a religious studies major in undergrad at UNC. And just really, I think, I guess probably some in high school, but also definitely into college, starting to question a lot of that theologically. I always had a theological mind, weirdly, even as a little kid. And just really just kind of noticed that that I was always a little questioning of sort of what was put in front of me, but very much like, now I'd use the language of faith-seeking understanding. I actually was never sort of rejecting anything, but always just trying to keep pushing and asking questions. And then as a religious studies major, I really loved learning about human beings and the way, we search for God and across religious traditions. And, that was something that was not like readily understood by the evangelical world. So I started to see some disconnect there. And then after college, I was a part of, it's called the Falls Church Episcopal, which actually pulled out of the Episcopal Church back in the early 2000s. And but there it was my first encounter with the Episcopal Church. And this is what Jeffrey asked earlier, I'm ordained as a transitional deacon, and I'm about to be in 3 weeks ordained as a priest. And I have a job for the last 8 months that I'll continue in as associate rector of a big church in Atlanta. But it was also, I had an internship at a place called the Southeast White House, which was probably we'd have called it progressive evangelical. That wasn't really a term really used back then, but it was progressive evangelical. And sitting in a under-resourced neighborhood and sitting around the kitchen of this place called the Southeast White House, my mentor, still a mentor of mine, had us read Bonhoeffer's Life Together. And that was my first encounter with Bonhoeffer. And then from there, I didn't have any imagination about what should have been the easy path for me, which was go get an MDiv at a divinity school or seminary. I just had no idea you could do that. And so I ended up at the University of Virginia in a religious studies master's and then Ph.D. program. And I went to UVA because of the project on lived theology that was really seeing Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King Jr. as sort of quintessential, quote, lived theologians who were working out theology on the ground in a social and political context. And I think that part of, I sort of worked through my conservative evangelical faith through getting a PhD, which I always joke and tell people there are much easier ways to like work out your faith stuff than getting a PhD. But I did it really carefully and really intentionally. And so Bonhoeffer became, a central interlocutor, which he still is. And then after UVA, I got a postdoc at Emory, and that led me to Candler. And then in my first semester there, Liz Bounds and some of the PhD students were starting the theology certificate program in the women's prison. And I was actually asked just to go teach one session on Bonhoeffer. And, I had zero experience in prisons. I think I'd almost barely thought about prisons. And this was even a couple of years before Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, came out and really sort of, I think, sort of sparked more of a national conversation. But I was really excited by the possibility of it, because I'd already at the Southeast White House sort of had a chance to be doing ministry as a layperson and putting myself in situations that were very different than my sort of privilege. I grew up at a boys' prep school, went co-ed in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I'd already experienced what it was like to be thinking about Christian faith in a really different environment than what I had grown up in. And then when I got into the prison and started teaching, it was the first time that any sort of, quote, ministry was just organically mutual, because I went in with like these texts on Bonhoeffer. I had no idea how the women would respond to them. I was like, I know nothing about you. I know nothing about your lives or prisons or what it's like to be in prison. So you have to, tell me these things and teach me. And so it just really became this beautiful, friendship and mutual learning. And so then from there, I just felt like I wanted to, and for my own growth, needed to stay working in the prison. And so then it led to teaching more and then being sort of a program director for a few years.
Mm-hmm. So, Thomas, how did you? What was your kind of intellectual and faith journey that led you into the context of reflection and in relationship to the prison?
Yeah, I mean, Jenny, that was really beautifully laid out. I think I can start a bit later in some sense. I guess that I just, I had. Like I said, my PhD work wasn't at all related to prisons or anything like that. I had kind of for a long time been critical of the prison system and had this sense that there was something really deeply, fundamentally wrong with the entire criminal legal system. But I think, and my mom had actually taught a college class in Maine at a state prison. And I guess, I had friends when I was younger, I'd run-ins with the law and stuff like that, but nothing too serious. But for all of those reasons, I kind of had a mixture of like a critical view on it and some, I guess, curiosity. My mom had a very positive experience teaching inside. So when I saw the email from Liz Bounds asking for people to teach an introductory theology class, and I'm not a theologian, by the way, but I was just like, this is like a, it's a good thing to do. It's something that will, maybe it'll be interesting. I'd like to meet some students inside, so on and so forth. I don't really know. But ultimately, when I came inside and met the students, and of course, anybody who's taught inside a prison will tell you at great length about how amazing the students often are. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. But basically, we're having the kind of intellectual conversations that I'd always wanted out of academic work, and had kind of been disappointed not to find to the extent that I'd hoped for in the academy per se. And also students who really really wanted to get a college degree while they were inside. I mean, that program was a certificate program in theological studies. And I mean, it is a great program. But a lot of the students were saying, we really want to be able to earn a degree inside. They had big ambitions for what they wanted to study and what they wanted to do with it and how they could put that back into practice. And I found myself over and over and over again meeting people where I was thinking, what this person could do and be with education is so much more than what I'm doing, writing about David Friedrich Strauss and romantic medicine, So I just, it definitely was a big shift for me in terms of how I thought about my work as an academic, I guess. And that led me to want to just continue supporting the students inside and trying to build more programming. And everything I've done since then has basically been an extension of that. So.
I mean, I think that that's underselling yourself just slightly in that, I mean, the move of like lived theology and wanting to see how, rigorous theological propositions or claims work themselves out on the ground. You're sort of a lived theorist, I'm like, you really love theory, and so I think that you really, I mean, it seemed like from what you told me about sort of what led you, that it really was like, I don't just want to read about theory. I want to see how this works itself out on the ground in a similar way that theology did that for me.
Yeah. So now there are a number of people in response to the lecture were deeply moved and realized that they were dramatically underinformed about the prison industrial complex, the way our legal system works and such. And so for those that may be unfamiliar with why it's such an ethical challenge, why it's, if you look at the different topics, we're wrestling with the nature of race and religion, or ecological suicide, or Christian nationalism. If you see those, you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But when you think of the way the prison system functions and the challenge of incarceration, if people aren't familiar with it, what are some of the assumptions that you both may have had going in that were challenged when you got to spend time asking big questions and wrestling with text and traditions and the lives of prisoners? Like, what do people not know that can help give that kind of lived experience that animates both of your work theologically and theoretically?
Do you want to go ahead, Jenny, or I can take a stab?
Well, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, just one thing that stood out in the question, I think, is that, I mean, one of the things that, of course, is surprising in thinking about this at any time is when you say, like, well, a lot of people haven't thought much about this or don't think much about this. And of course, I think that's something fundamental to just center right from the beginning, is that this is, 2 million people in prison, 11 million plus cycling in and out of jails every year. Entire communities are, in some ways destroyed by the whole process. And it's such a fundamental part of our social fabric that touches on so many of our lives in ways that we don't even realize. And yet at the same time, it's by design something that's so far hidden away from public view and scrutiny. And so I think it's very much in line with like with the work that Jenny and I did together to think about how that is rooted in the way we think about our sense of moral responsibility on the one hand, and how that's also rooted in a particular way of thinking about morality on the other. So, yeah.
Yeah, the first thing that came to my mind is, I mean, I just had no clue what to think or what to expect. And so there's sort of two things that come to mind. One might be really silly, but I'll say it anyway. The first is that, I so didn't know what to think. I remember not knowing how I'd be accepted, and will they think I'm just this like naive Southern belle, and what kind of clothes should I wear, and I ended up just being like, well, I can only wear the clothes I have in my closet, so I'll just wear what I have. And in the first first class session, we're on Bonhoeffer, when we're taking a bathroom break, and they're all standing in line, and I'm just standing there with them, and the conversation suddenly like, oh, I love your boots, and I love your shirt, and there was just this great acceptance, and just a sense of realizing that really I can just bring myself into this context, and they were willing to bring themselves and to share so much about their lives, and it was just this space of real kind of, like I said, mutual vulnerability, and real existential life or death questions of faith that they wanted to work through, which is what makes it so exciting. But then the second thing is, I had like read liberation theology and just kind of the basic understanding that people on the margins of society are the ones who can understand the Bible the best and have these contributions to theology that those of us who are privileged or white, or the sort of white Western tradition, doesn't have. And it was just incredibly obvious that that's true in the prison context, that just, and with women, it was so many of them, especially in the first cohort, they're sort of handpicked in some ways by the chaplain. So most of them were already self-identified Christians, and it was open to anyone. But that first cohort was that way. And a lot of them had been either been a part of conservative churches before prison, or they've been evangelized by conservative churches in prison, and had heard the message about who they were as women, and that they couldn't, that their ideas didn't matter, or they thought they weren't smart. And then they were just engaging with the material with these super insightful, wise, new ways of thinking. So just to kind of see that firsthand was really exciting.
One other thing that I also want to say, and I like in terms of what I saw that was different than what I expected, is that I think the biggest thing that keeps coming up for me year after year is that, I think going into it, you expect it to be this highly kind of hierarchically structured and rigidly organized entity that's like really works like clockwork almost, and I mean, that's sort of some of the critical writing about prisons like presents it that way. But it is very hierarchical, but it's also very arbitrary. And a lot of stuff just kind of happens on a day-to-day basis in a way that doesn't feel like it has any rhyme or reason. Things are constantly changing. Rules are changing. Procedures are changing. What happens on a day-to-day basis is changing. And so people it's kind of like a series of shocks more than like a really regimented routine, I mean, is how it often felt in practice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the members who asked to remain anonymous said they were really moved in the lecture when it got to the point of Thomas, when you talked about no one is the worst decision that they've made in their life, and the commenter said that so much of that kind of moral reductionism, the kind of binaries of good or bad or victim and violator and things that they learned in church, they trusted them and seized to them because they knew that meant they were on the right side, until in the same week they had multiple tragedies in their family, lost their cool, and made their worst mistake, and they ended up in jail. And the individual said, like, if I hadn't been there, I would have never known, been in a situation long enough to know the stories of everyone that's there. And very few of them, they said, is a story where what we do makes sense.
Yeah.
And so they said to share the brief outline and kind of open that up, because a lot of people that haven't had that experience, the members said, probably hear that challenge without realizing what it's like if your worst decision puts you in a situation where that kind of moral reduction and these kind of binaries that justify the logic of the incarceration system, it break down. Like if you don't get there, then that story and those divisions are part of how you cherish your self-understanding.
Yeah, that's so true. And I mean, first of all, thank you to whoever shared that. I mean, that's really, it is exactly a case in point of, I think, what you see over and over and over again, which is exactly that. And I mean, of course, like I can't take, I mean, like the idea of people not being the worst thing they've ever done and all this, a lot of the stuff, even a lot of the ideas that are communicated through our essay are not things that are original to me by any stretch of the imagination. There are a lot of people doing great writing about prisons and so on who've been thinking about this stuff for a longer time than I have. But it's amazing because you kind of, the kind of image that you have in your mind, I think, through the way that prisons are represented and the system is represented and so on and so forth, you really imagine that you're going to be encountering, people have done something really horrific and you can't make sense of it and whatever. I mean, and in some cases, like we have, of course, like met students who have done stuff that by any normal description you would think, no, that is pretty horrific. But when you meet the person and you know the person and you know who they are, they're just that person. And I mean, it's not, and they may have done this one thing, but they're also this funny, smart, interesting, person who does all these other wonderful things and who's compassionate and caring and kind and giving of themselves and trying to give something back. And that's all true. It's all true. And it's a real deficit of our moral imagination that we can't hold those things together, that we can't see that that's possible, because it is absolutely true. If any of us look at our own lives, I mean, that's true of every single one of us, that we've done stuff that doesn't fit within our own moral self-conception. And we've also done stuff that is better than we thought we could be, probably. So, yeah.
It also has a sort of a point to be made about, so-called prison ministry, which, some people don't like that term because it, I think, connotes kind of an individualistic understanding of things. But, I just, when you asked the question, I was thinking of one of the students early on who talked about, that she was getting letters from some like well-meaning church people that were, sharing the gospel with her and inviting her to accept Jesus into her heart. And she was like, I already did. And I did that before I committed this crime. and I was a practicing Christian, and so just all the ways in which we're just human beings are really complex,
Yeah. So I want to kind of go back. One of the things about this this series that's been compelling for me to participate in.
Did Jeff go mute for y'all?
Yes.
Oh well, I can tell he's very serious, and I'm gonna text him and tell him, you went mute. I bet he unplugged his microphone on accident. That, or he's just so excited.
Wait, should we give him a hand gesture?
Yeah, I just texted him. Hey, Jeff. Well, I'll ask a question that someone sent in, and while I'm asking it, I will text him and tell him. Okay. He's so
he's realizing.
Okay. We can't hear you, Jeff. Okay. At the beginning of the essay, both of you talk in different ways about how our imagination's captured. One of the questions was, what does it mean that the police-prison relationship has captured our imagination, and does it assume a picture of the human? Theologians call it anthropology, that needs to be problematized.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's somebody put inherent worth and dignity of every person in the chat, Sue Ferguson, and I mean, there's something about I think this is probably an obvious point, but if you think about any harm that's done, there's so much that surrounds it. I mean, if you look at, of course, there's the immediate interpersonal harm that's taken place, but there's also the context, there's the conditions, there's the history, there's the social structures that have fed into it, there's the outcome, there's the community that it affects, and all of that is part of the real human experience of a given harm. And yet what I think one of the big questions for me about the prison system is not just, I mean, it is, of course, important. Like, what is it doing to the people inside? What is it doing to the people who work there? But what is it doing to all of us? How is it shaping us as moral subjects, that this is a fundamental part of our society and life and culture? And I think one of the things that it does is it allows us to sort of think that we have done justice by simply focusing on this one thing and this one individual that we can then address in whatever way. And it really doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of what it would really mean to think seriously about a given harm and all of the different levels of responsibility and accountability that there could be for it. I mean, if you think about like a murder, instead of asking, I mean, people think like, oh, well, we just have to deal with the person who has committed the murder, and that's sort of how this whole system works. But what does it mean instead to say, how do we actually think about this in terms of what does it mean, instead of trying to put away people who are convicted of murder, to think about how do we actually stop people murdering each other? And that's a much bigger responsibility, but it's one that the system basically allows us to avoid, because it says, no, we've done justice. You don't need to worry about that anymore. We're done. And so by having this kind of this moral reductionism, it is a reduction of our whole human experience. It also excuses us from the entire range of social responsibility that we might otherwise feel.
Yeah.
Okay, Tripp.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
I don't know. Satan. That's what it was.
So I was just going to say that in terms of the question about, I can't quite remember how it was posed about it, does it make us rethink some of our theology, especially around anthropology? I think that for me, thinking theologically while getting to know people in prison and doing some reading around prisons, I think it reshapes like every theological category, and it's not just the sort of analysis of prisons. It's also my work with Bonhoeffer and things like that. But just one sort of theological way of sort of adding to what Thomas said is even thinking, eschatologically about like what is the new earth that God promises, and what does that look like? And if we think that what that looks like is restoration of all things and the reconciliation of all people, then that means that, that God is working to save both the person who has done the harm and the person who has been harmed. And so therefore, if that's sort of the eschatological vision, that people who have harmed will be held accountable, will face what they've done, will repent. People who have been harmed will be freed from that harm, will be healed. Then that sort of eschatological vision has to affect our ethics as well. So that's just one example. But I think that thinking about on the ground how we deal with harm can reshape, or I think actually helps us see what's already in Scripture in a deeper way.
So I can jump back in here for just a minute.
Yeah.
We lost, I think, a lot of what I was going to say. I'm not sure how it happened. But one of the things I found most compelling about the lecture was the sort of different understanding of where religionless Christianity are, an understanding that Bonhoeffer can take us beyond morality and the moralities that we've constructed with our religion to divide the world into the pure and the impure. And so, when we come to the things that you were talking about, those of us who are supposedly pure have constructed an entire societal apparatus to deal with those that we consider to be the impure, right? And so purity becomes, in that sense, a totalitarian agenda. And we don't just see it in the incarceral system. We see it in the desire to shut down Target. are to go into Target and to, remove pride displays. I mean, this notion that I and I alone have morality. What I really loved about your piece and connecting it to creation and fall is that is a kind of an embodiment of our very fallenness.
Mm-hmm.
To say that we ourselves know what the pure is, and therefore we will launch war against the impure.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore then morality becomes a totalitarian agenda to make sure that others will conform and align and straighten up into what our moral vision is.
Mm-hmm.
And then that depends in some senses on who in society is able to say what home looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Who has the power to decide what law looks like, right? What the transgression of the law looks like, and how we deal with those transgressions in the carceral system that we ourselves have constructed. Because what it is that we've constructed is built on a demonic logic.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm just shutting up right there.
Mhm.
That was a beautiful summary.
Yeah.
Oh, a beautiful summary, Jeff. No wonder Satan
I was
ruined
kind
your
of hoping-
microphone the first time.
Well, I mean, okay, so I'm sorry, and I won't say much more. We, as a society, are suffering from an epidemic of self-righteousness
Mm-hmm.
from all corners of the political spectrum. But the self-righteousness that sees itself as not having to relate to the other.
Yeah.
When an authentic following of Christ, and this is what, I swear to God, if the church were to have a future, it seems like one of the things that we should most be saying over and over again in our time is freedom is the freedom for others,
Mm-hmm.
not the freedom from others. The freedom from others creates a fascist architecture that imprisons us all in our own self-righteousness. And the kinds of interactions that you're talking about in prison, I've had those too. And it makes you realize this is standing before me, another human being
Mm-hmm.
who should not be judged on their worst day.
Yeah.
That piece, the epidemic of self-righteousness. I mean, that just seems spot on and very much in line with the kind of tendency that we were trying to identify in the essay too. I mean, just this, it almost seems like in the absence of, and I mean, it all goes to the same thing. I mean, in the absence of, or in a society that increasingly, and in the interests of ultimately very powerful people and so on and so forth, I mean, does isolate people and does divide people and does alienate people from one another. I mean, that the satisfaction of self-righteousness in many ways takes the place of other kinds of forms of satisfaction you might find in communal life. I mean, people owning each other on social media or whatever this is out of date, but you know what I mean? That's like, that feels like a more, it almost is taken, I mean, instead of like, like building community or organizing or other things that can actually give you this sense of meaning and purpose in life. And I mean, that's so that seems right to me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think we highlight in the essay is about how this idea of not judging others is it's a conversion experience. It's a totally new way of being in the world. And if we take seriously, and I've been trying this for a number of years since writing about this, for my dissertation and first book, and really I'm gonna try to really not judge and not condemn and see what that feels like. And actually, I learned a lot of this from watching Thomas. I feel like he does this very naturally, but yeah, that it's that for Bonhoeffer, in a number of his writings, he's focusing on, if we think we have the knowledge of good and evil, then we set ourselves up as judge, period. And then we start dividing and we start saying who deserves, and we're always the ones that don't deserve the bad things. And so it really, I mean, I think that at the heart of part of what I really like about this essay is that sort of, in some ways, the culmination of what I was trying to say over and over, but never felt like I quite said it clear enough. And that is just that if we think of Christian faith as individual morality, we're already missing the mark. It's just not what it's about at all. And one of the other parts that's related to this is in a section, something that Thomas wrote about saying, that all of this is built on the idea that people deserve what's being done to them in prison. And part of this conversation back and forth between Bonhoeffer and then what I'm learning from the folks I know in prison. And then from the ways in which we talk about prisons, especially around issues of retributive justice and restorative justice. And so, retributive justice is that you get what you deserve. So if you do bad things, you deserve bad things. If you do good things, you deserve good things. But we normally think of it negatively. And then restorative justice is this whole different paradigm in terms of thinking about how to deal with harm. And then it maps on super well to basic Christian theological claims about the healing of everyone involved and the restoration of all things. And so, one of the, we tend to even, the atonement theory of substitutionary atonement, which a lot of people critique for good reasons. And I actually think that Bonhoeffer does not hold a substitutionary atonement. He has a representative atonement theory. But even that model, that's we call it grace because we say, well, we as human beings deserve punishment, but Jesus stood in our place and took the punishment for us. That's still a model of deserving and not deserving. And what I feel so strongly about, it's like the core of my faith now, is that it has nothing to do with desert. That's just totally, again, we're just off on the completely wrong path if we think that any of this has to do with what we deserve. It's all about that God is always wanting to restore us. It's not about what we do or don't deserve. So again, it's a fundamental core shift that changes everything if you begin with that.
So there were a couple questions that maybe I'll package them, and I think it'd be great to hear Ginny and Jeff discuss this because they're kind of like about the Bonhoeffer text and his context. Ginny, you mentioned in it that one of the tasks, like, of wrestling with a scholar is in the present is if you don't really set the scholar or the figure from history in their context and wrestle with it there, the application to the present could be like what would happen if you wrote a Bonhoeffer book and were a giant Trump fan after January 6th? Like, what's up with that? Like, these there was a setting that matters. And in the Bonhoeffer text, there are these footnotes, right, to where Bonhoeffer is exegeting a text and criticizing the German liberal theological tradition via Hegel, Fichte, and stuff, like all these philosophers I wrote comprehensive exams on and love. And then in your essay, you talk about how Bonhoeffer's picking up this critique of morality from Barth in the context and radicalizing it. Could maybe you and Jeff talk a bit about, for those of us that don't know Bonhoeffer's context and setting enough, like what is he doing in that exegesis? What's the historical context where we see him retelling, right, the fall story? So we see the kind of traction this reading has with the challenge of the church and faithfulness in his historical context.
Go for it, Jeffrey.
Well, I'm just going to go ahead and say that, Bonhoeffer and Barth are writing in the same context that any human society exists within. They exist within a certain social construction of reality, some of which morality and religion have been used to justify. So, for instance, in their time, they're trying to deal with the aftermath of World War I. They're trying to deal with the fact that bourgeois morality was more than able to justify the use of violence to maintain domination. So there's a kind of a crisis theology that emerges with Barth and, later on with Bonhoeffer, that morality is a function of society to legitimate violence, that dehumanizing violence and domination over others can be granted moral authority by the religious ethos that one finds himself within. And Christianity participates in that. And not just in Germany, but also in 21st century America and anywhere else that professes to have a Christian sort of influence. So there is a morality then that gets constructed. And I think, Jenny, help me if I've got this wrong. Barth, was he the first one to use the term bourgeois morality, or was it Bonhoeffer? I can't remember, but
Barth that used it.
But their whole notion that where has our morality led us? It's led us into a space of antichrist, the destruction of our society, the destruction of our culture, the destruction of the world. So if we're looking for the way of following Christ, morality is not necessarily it. Now, I might have that wrong, and I'll be happy to be corrected.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, just in broad brushstrokes, that, I mean, it's, the Barth is critiquing the Protestant liberal tradition at the time that is focused on human experience and seeing the failures of the World War. And so then Barth, this neo-Orthodox who's going back to these basic Orthodox claims. And the main one, that I highlight in the essay is that no one is righteous, and this is from Romans. And so, Bonhoeffer later, part of what makes him such an interesting figure is that he's often, taking kind of the best of two different sides, and kind of finding a third way. So he's very, I think he has a lot of Protestant liberalism within himself as well. But in this moment, he's holding on to this idea that no one is righteous. And so what does that mean then for Christians to really have that, very, again, like back to my growing up, conservative evangelicals, at least when I was growing up, would very much be on board with the fact that God alone is righteous. No one is righteous, only God. And so what does it mean, though, to say that even when we, again, if you're thinking in kind of an evangelical mode, even when we accept Jesus, even when we have the Holy Spirit, that still doesn't make us righteous, right? Just or believing the right things doesn't, that we have to always understand that we are under the judgment of God, that everything that we do is imperfect. And so to have that be our baseline instead of having a sense of our correct religion and our individual assumed purity be what separates us, that the no one is righteous except for God is really what brings us in solidarity with all people. And I think it's actually interesting to think about how much Bonhoeffer talks about solidarity. In some ways before his time. His theology is really based on that Jesus is the human being, the representative of all of humanity. And so there is this basic solidarity among all people.
One of the things that I've really appreciated about your using the text out of Creation and Fall, and we talked about this a little bit last week, actually, is the way in which the text is used by Bonhoeffer. So, there's no assumption that any of this is historical. Bonhoeffer is using the text to say that the author or authors of, in this case, maybe author of the text is trying to understand human beings and the decisions that they make and the way that they create communities and societies. And what I loved about this is the notion that the serpent uses a pious question. So and this is what I was trying to talk about a minute ago, the great temptation is to piety. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is not tearing me away from God. This is going to make me more godly. And in that reaching for, that sort of very piety, we actually fragment ourselves then into a brokenness that what is it? Deus sicut. Mm-hmm. We are the ones then that get to decide what's good and what's evil. So when the great commandment of love God and love your neighbors yourself Well, yeah, sure, but we can shade that, over here in this direction or over here in this direction. No, that was the commandment. But now I know better. Or I think in your essay in the book, you talk about the Sermon on the Mount as command.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that Christian tradition has sort of looked at that command and said, well, were these really concrete commandments on how we were supposed to live our life? So, one of the things that I really appreciated about Bonhoeffer's approach to the text is that he's reading the text almost existentially, as a way of sort of teasing out who we are, because that text is always sort of, saying who we are. And I kept thinking about the way that Dostoevsky uses the temptation narratives in the Grand Inquisitor passage out of the Brothers Karamazov. And he draws a richness from those temptation narratives that, many people simply don't find there. But to me, it goes to the heart of what the temptation narratives are trying to teach. Mm-hmm. And I think the way that Bonhoeffer sort of employs those texts to raise questions about human anthropology, I think it's really profound.
Yeah. I mean, the base claim, I think, of creation and fall is that we are creatures, and it is good to be a creature, and we are supposed to be creatures. We're not supposed to be like God, little g, because the irony is, by being creatures, by being free for others, we are actually like the living God, but we're not supposed to try to be like God in the sense, like you were saying, of being pious or being more religious. And I think that in writing this essay was really the first time that I saw that connection between that basic claim to be creatures and then his claim and, ethics and the rest about being the real human being. And then the switch that happens. So we are not to try to be like God. We are to live into our creatureliness. And then the incarnate God becomes the real human being. So there's just this, this constant move towards accepting the good, even of our limitations as creatures and human beings.
It strikes me too that's really beautiful. And I appreciate, Jeff, before you making the connection to fascism as well, because in a sense, I think it is true that on the interpersonal level, that kind of ability to excuse ourselves from our creaturely responsibility and solidarity with one another, and to be able to say, I am righteous, I am good, is on the social level. I mean, all of this, the prison system today and, fascism in the early 20th century in Germany, both are rooted in these histories of like colonialism, for example, and imperialism, which show this kind of like world-striding ambition that is also, rooted in a sense of righteous morality and so on and so forth. And I think you can really trace all of that back to this kind of initial, whatever it is in us that enables us to excuse ourselves from that responsibility and solidarity we have with other people. So like, what is it? I like Aimé Césaire, when he writes about colonialism being the kind of root cause of fascism in some ways, what is it doing when the French soldier, kills the little boy and everybody just accepts it, over time that shapes who we are. And I think it's still shaping who we are. And one of the ways it does so is by giving us this whole kind of moral ideology that lets us excuse ourselves from our immediate responsibility to one another.
Do you think that, and there were a couple of questions around this, that Bonhoeffer's kind of theological exegesis of the text, he's bringing both the challenges the people of God are asking in the present to it, and thinking, what if the normative theological understanding, the way we've learned to interpret and read this text, is actually part of the problem for generating the crisis that's there, right? And I think it's that double track that goes into the exegesis of the fall story that raises this it raises the kind of profound challenge of the role of the law, or this criticism of morality. And there, one of the questioners asked how connected this is to the kind of more recent New Testament scholarship, where once you think Paul in talking about the law isn't just about the Jewish law, but the Roman law, then so much of Romans gets more intense, more dialectical in a sense, because it's going, no, what we call law or bourgeois morality is really the justification of a domination system.
Yes.
It's not setting things as it's right, that it gives to the state, which is protecting power, privilege, and possessions on behalf of the few that hoard them, the violence and wrath of God. Like, there's all these shifts that happen when we start to recognize that the function of the law, and that Bonhoeffer's critiquing, is ultimately the obstruction of justice, not its living out. There's this inversion of our identity that you then see right in his Christology essays that resonate so deeply with this, that the law actually is a legitimization or the normalization of civilization's most ugly violence and kind of secrets. Like, all of a sudden they get the power to speak as God, and it ends up preserving these perverse structures. There were three different people who all asked questions that were something like, what are those kinds of questions that and are those kind of habits of interpretation you think generate a church that is blind to, say, something like incarceration, or blind to the way the law or normative structures of morality are unable to even ask or be provoked to respond to the big questions that are getting raised in the class?
All of these comments have so much in them that my mind goes in like three different directions as I'm listening to you. I'll say a piece that was my last thought. Well, first, okay, I'll say my first thought first. That at first I thought where you were going, which maybe you were going there, is so Philip Ziegler is one of the first people that I saw looking at how Bonhoeffer, his theology and understanding of Christology really overlaps a lot with Pauline apocalyptic theology. And so then if you're talking about that, you're talking about sort of powers and principalities, and then the law. Anything can become a power and principality, any institution, system, ideology, that is dominating. And that is central to what Bonhoeffer cares about, not only because of the obviousness of the historical moment, but you see it through a lot of his theological claims about in creation and fall, about accepting limits. The other person is a limit, and life together is Christ being the mediator, so that we respect limits and all that. So that was kind of the first place that my mind went, that I think that it's really productive to read Bonhoeffer through this Pauline apocalyptic understanding, which has a lot to do with kind of a Christus Victor model of salvation. But the other thing that's a little more maybe simple is just the fact that that gets to the sort of constructive point that the person was just making, is that for Bonhoeffer, Christian ethics is not about following universal moral principles. So in a sense, if you think about like a basic ethics class, Bonhoeffer's not a deontologist, even though some people, I was taught by someone that in grad school that he was, because he had like a divine command ethic, which I don't think is true at all. He's not about deontology, and he's much, because what he is concerned about is that the church conforms to the incarnate, crucified, and risen Christ in the world. Out of that shape, discerns the will of God in the moment. All of that takes a real relationship with a living God in community, So it is. So I think that part of this is how readily privileged North American Christians just want, and it goes back to morality, right? Because when we think of morality in a general way, we think of deontology. We just think of where are the rules and let me follow them. And that's not what Christianity is about. It's much more complicated than that, because it's about a relationship. with a living God and a following the person of Jesus, not an idea that we call Jesus. So, so all of that, yeah, I think that a lot of, we get ourselves in trouble because a lot of us that call ourselves Christians just don't do the hard work of discipleship in community.
Yeah, that if we, just one place for the future of the church to start would be to start taking a serious look at our how we define freedom.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I keep going back to the freedom from others,
Mm-hmm.
which is what defines our societies so strong today. You know, I want the freedom to do what I want to do,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't want any moral claim. And so that is the imprisonment within the fascist architecture of the mind and the soul that I was talking about earlier, because then society is imprisoned. So one place would be for churches to start having a deeper conversations about what is freedom for the other, and what form of concrete life, and Bonhoeffer was always concerned about material reality. What does following Christ look like in the concrete material world? And so what you and Thomas are doing, for instance, you know, in the prison is an example of that. But so many people seem to think that Christianity, and boy, am I going to get in trouble here, is a matter of being saved and not a matter of mediating grace.
Mm-hmm. Even asking, it might be easier, first ask, what are the ways in which we as a church are practicing freedom from, a false freedom?
Yeah.
Even things about, like the church where I serve is in the middle of Midtown Atlanta. And so how do we handle people who are unhoused and who use the bathroom on our sidewalks? Do we want to be free from them, or do we want to be free for them? What would being free for? Well, maybe just providing a bathroom might be one easy way to be free for, instead of free from and just trying to, get rid or whatever. So I think that probably we can come up with a lot of concrete ways that we already practice this false freedom of being free from others. Just get them out of my life. I just don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
Which is what the prison system is, right?
Yeah. So Tripp, I don't mean to intrude on your next question, but I saw some people scrolling on the side of my screen, mm-hmm. and it raised a question I had actually written down. And I'm interested in everybody's response to this, because when you first approach this material, you're thinking, well, judgments have to be made. There is good and there is evil in the world, and we can't just withdraw from that. So I'm wondering, what might be the difference between discernment and the moral judgment as a manifestation of our fallenness? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I think of is, first, I mean, we tried to say in the essay that we can't judge people's moral worth, right? So that's the first place. You just, but I do, and obviously, discernment is a huge role in Bonhoeffer's writings. But I think that one of the things, because I was thinking about this too, even just like today or yesterday, I've been thinking a lot about, in sort of ministry context and sort of psychology context, you hear a lot about boundaries, about the importance of respecting other people's boundaries and kind of thinking about your own. And then that maps on well to Bonhoeffer's language that we mentioned earlier about having limits. And so I think with in that language of boundaries, and again here I'm thinking a lot about just the basic terms that are used in sort of prison conversations about the importance of holding someone accountable for harm that they've done as a way of restoration. And that's a kind of boundary, kind of saying, I'm not going to be treated that way. So, just being able to sort of name for yourself when someone is trespassing over your boundaries. And so it's not, I guess what I'm trying to say is that by not judging, we're not saying it's a free for all. We're still, prison abolitionists, restorative justice are very concerned about how do we deal with harm? How do we deal with violence? And so there's ways to do that, but without judging the moral worth of someone. It's about how can we hold people accountable in a way that will lead to restoration, and then how can we heal those who have been harmed. Thomas, you can jump in better than me, but that's kind
I love what you said. And I mean, I think one of the really remarkable things about the criminal legal system as it exists today is the extent to which it utterly fails to establish any kind of meaningful accountability as we would understand it. And I mean, I think that's people who are survivors of harms would say that, as well as a lot of people who are incarcerated, that they never, I mean, I have talked to, I mean, I'm just saying, like, anecdotally, but I've talked to people who are, 20 years into a sentence and talking about it. I never really feel like I've had a chance to take responsibility for that one thing, but instead I've experienced this thing that day after day after day is harming me in ways that have nothing to do with that. And so I think the system is a kind of case in point of how we are, totally failing to have any kind of meaningful accountability while having enough of a pretense of it that excuses us from thinking about our real responsibility to one another. And in some ways it's sort of obvious when you say anybody taking a close look at it can go like, okay, we seem to be trying to do something about this particular is done. But of course, there isn't any real accountability for all the harms that the system itself is doing. I mean, what about all the people who are, getting sick during the pandemic? What about all the people who are, having mental health crises because of being in lockdown for years on end? What about all the people who just got their 4th parole denial and it's breaking their and their families' hearts and they already have done all their time? What, what I mean? It's just, what about the people who can't get jobs after, I mean, there's all this stuff that we just don't even have the language or capacity to think about the harms associated with it. And at the same time, I think for people who are survivors of harms, who have been on the other side of the criminal legal process, they also are not getting what they need. They're also not getting the healing that they need from the trauma that they go through. As a society, we just are woefully under-equipped for really grappling with what it means to hold accountable, do justice, and heal. We just don't have. And if you start from there, if you start from saying, what does it look like to have accountability, justice, and reduce violence? Nobody's going to come up with the prison system that we have today because it doesn't do those things. So anyway,
Yeah. Like, thinking of your original question, Jeff, like in the discernment and even how Bonhoeffer kind of reframes a lot of these questions in the reading with this echo of thinking about Imago Dei there, then thinking about the image of God in Christ and like what the incarnation does. Like, the text that pops in mind is Jesus like getting confronted. There's a woman caught in adultery, and he says, "Whoever's without sin cast the first stone." Is this sense where it's not saying don't acknowledge the reality. It also is provocative in the sense of there's someone else involved in the story, not there. But it does say, like, what is happening in that kind of working out of morality in scare quotes or judgment and all that kind of thing is being problematized, because he's asking us to think about our own selves and the way we are participating in this. And who's the one who has permission to throw? Is Jesus in the Gospels kind of depiction of him. And so, but then his attentiveness to her involves go and sin no more. And that is a reaffirmation of her creatureliness, for thinking of Bonhoeffer's language. It's a reaffirmation that there are boundaries of living that are geared towards our mutual flourishing as people, as community, as these kinds of things. And what is so often kind of layered out in the selections from Creation and the Fall, but also in the book itself, are the ways sin ultimately breaks down the boundaries of flourishing, and then locates each individual as the law of what's norming for their own existence. It puts the individual in the center that's now deciding, because they have now the divine perspective of good and evil and judgment and this kind of thing. And I feel like there's when we ask the question of discernment, so often we have jumped quite a few steps ahead almost immediately. We don't do the taking stock of ourselves and the system and the context and all these kinds of things. We don't get to know the individual outside of the context of whatever violation our culture's decided is worth assessing, all this kind of stuff. And if justice is retributive, and then what gets justice is selective, then it's hard to take seriously the system as ultimately is ultimately good, right? Like the amount of wage theft in America in the last 10 years doubles the amount of property stolen from pharmacies and Walmart and Target. There are more working class people whose hours are underreported, or they don't get the benefits they get for working once they get to 30 hours a week. They don't get overtime and all these kinds of things. Those companies have stolen more money from the workers, who are the very same populace ends up stealing, right, from those stores, than the thieves. But what is it everyone runs on for law and order? It's not, let's not let multinational billionaires keep pillaging wage theft from the working class that generates, right, the actual needs that lead to this. No. Let's lock everything up. Oh, let's take access to fresh vegetables out of poor communities because they steal it. Let's raise prices here so we can put in someone with a gun. Like it's just kind of dumbfounding, right? And I think that discernment question kind of begs us to go ask each layer of responsibility, each layer of relational connection, and not pick the one we've isolated as where we demonstrate how good we are by judging them.
Yeah.
Right.
It's their ideological judgments, even if it's true, right? Like even if she's caught in adultery, it's just who is the one that was caught and about to be stoned? Her, in a patriarchal system. By who? These other patriarchs that are sitting there. And what do they have? Permission to do it. Why? Because the only thing that matters is they weren't caught by her. And Jesus kind of undoes that by reintroducing the humanity of the person and the dignity of the Imago Dei, and the kind of affirmation of grace in this kind of incarnational Christology. It actually permits us to be honest about all of the layers of our brokenness, because we no longer have to be the center that justifies ourselves as good, or the nation that does it in the same way by what we do in our incarceration issues, but also what we do in our foreign policy.
So I just want to jump real quick. It's now down the list, but someone gave a bit of a pushback, but it made me realize just a quick defining of terms maybe might be helpful. That when we're saying do not judge, what I'm talking about is judgment that leads to the condemnation of the individual and therefore to no relationship, right? So even in the Gospels, it's back to back, Jesus's commands: do not judge, do not condemn. So that's the piece. It's the judgment that leads to an ostracization, a condemnation, that kind of thing. And when we were talking about sort of putting that relationship to accountability, often we think the only way we can hold people accountable is by punishing them. And that's not true. With restorative justice, there's all ways to hold someone accountable. And if you're in a restorative justice process where the person who's been harmed and the person who's done the harm and some other community members are there talking, there's discernment that happens. And so the person who's been harmed can say, the way I want you to be held accountable is through this thing right here. And then the person in relationship says, okay, I'll do that. And so there's discernment there, but it's discernment and accountability are all relational concepts. Judgment and condemnation is the breaking apart of relationship.
And, to Tripp's point before too, all of our moral language and all the ways we think about judgment are so hyper focused on the individual level and individual morality that we we need to develop a better language for making sense of this kind of collective harms that come through. I mean, wage theft, you can look at it on a case-by-case basis, but it is also, of course, something that's systemic, and it has to do with, economic injustice. It often has to do with racism. It has to do with like all of these things that we can kind of name as collective harms, but we still don't. Our moral language, again, is just so hyper focused on the individual that it often excuses us from having to grapple with those big picture collective harms. And if we don't get that right, now with the climate crisis and everything, think about moral collective responsibility and we keep offloading it onto bad individuals who we blame for everything that goes wrong, we're never going to be able to deal with any of this. And so
our very morality cloaks an agenda of domination, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, we've said that before today, but the way you've just laid it out is once it becomes that matter of individual judgment, then you're more likely to be manipulated by the larger systems in play because they will punish you if you do not maintain adherence to their morality.
Mm-hmm. And even like what we were saying before, I mean, often it's sort of, the law doesn't necessarily exist to create a regularity. It exists to, after the fact, be able to do the punishment or justify whatever the thing is that is done. So even there, it's not even that people are required to. It's that the moral ideology means that I can always call you into question if somebody goes through the system. I mean, it's what we were talking about before. That doesn't just affect them for the length of their prison sentence. That means often for the rest of their lives. That can come up and be used to exclude them from all kinds of things. And that does it has a social function of maintaining status hierarchies. It has an economic function that if people are desperate for work, you have this reserve army of labor. It does all this other work for maintaining an unjust social order.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I want to hope our listeners really hear that last thing, because it is a lifelong punishment. If you spend 6 months in prison, but you're convicted of a felony, when you leave, it will be there for the rest of your life. Every job application you have to sign, may have that question on it. Every time you fill out a TSA application, for, trusted traveler, whatever, have you ever been convicted of a felony? I mean, and every time someone knows that about another person, somewhere in the back of their mind, that person is being judged. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that, oh, you're a felon, well, all of a sudden, we have an idea of what that means, Mm-hmm. So there is no restoration for a lot of people in some people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
So there are two topics that came up related to the lecture that are also in the reading I want to ask, because they got brought up a number of times. And at the end, I definitely want one of the questions there, Thomas, I know you've spent time thinking about this, but other kinds of models and ways of when you're focused not just on how the incarceration system reveals to us the problems writ large, but what are some other places or countries and such. I want to make sure we do that at the end. But there are these two questions that showed up in various forms repeatedly. One of them is how does this framework for thinking about the fall or good and evil, this kind of rejection of a kind of moral reductionism, frame a theological pushback to the way tribal ethical posturing works, or a kind of performative ethics for whichever of your team, or the way different tribes do canceling each other, and this notion of performative purity.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's a problem.
I'm against it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what Jeffrey said earlier. We have an epidemic of self-righteousness. It's a battle over morality, is what I called it in my Church for the World book. It's just, I mean, in terms of, it's across the board of whether people, it's an American thing now, and within Christianity, it's progressive and conservatives just battling over who has the best morality. And yeah, I mean, it's deeply self-righteous. It lacks humility. It lacks the ability to listen and to come up with creative, constructive ways forward. Because I mean, this is another piece where Bonhoeffer, he says that if we're judging, we're not doing. It's the opposite. Judging means you don't have to do anything because you're already right, but if you're obeying Jesus's commands, which I call them practices, right? I think that's what they are. If you're actually trying to live this stuff out, then you can't be under the illusion that you're doing it right. I mean, this is part of the basic parts about even like volunteering in a prison and doing, teaching theology or whatever else. Mrs. Thomas's work now about moral injury in part is there's all sorts of ways where it's so clear that you're not pure. I mean, even things like going in to do a theology certificate or even a college degree program where someone can come out with, or not come out, maybe still stay in, but have something. There's still a sense in which you're bolstering the prison system in some way, like you're a part of that whole system, so I think so for Bonhoeffer, that there's a real logic to all of this, that when you start to get involved in the real concerns of the world, you realize that you can no longer be good, that because of the fallenness, the messiness, the complexity, you're going to get tainted. And if what you're concerned about is your own moral righteousness or your own ideological purity, then don't even try. Just stay on the sidelines and judge everyone else. But if you actually want to try to do something constructive in the world, then try, and then see, that things are complex. And it does lead, if you're really genuine about it, it does lead to real humility, because you realize you're caught up in all this stuff that are powers and principalities that are stronger than you are.
I really love that. And I wanted to say that something I feel like I've learned from you, Jenny, is to think about co-creation. And I think that, it's, if we are not sort of invited to be these just moral actors in the world, we are nevertheless to participate in the possibility of together building a better world, I suppose. I mean, I don't know if that's the right way to say it or not, but that's I think what excites. And I mean, you're absolutely right. Like going inside and teaching and all that stuff. I mean, there are things that you kind of have to, even in a conversation like this, I'm always nervous about what exactly I say or don't say or share or don't say. And I mean, that means that there's sort of moral compromises going on, even in the back of my mind as we're having this conversation together, and nevertheless, you kind of, I think but I also, I feel a sense of not just responsibility, but joy of being able to work with people inside and people who are outside, who are community leaders and leaders in higher education who are system impacted, and in kind of trying desperately to build a way out of this, and seeing people come up with creative other ways of doing justice, of living together, and just trying those out is exciting. And it's important to be critical and all that stuff, but in the end, we also have to be willing to get our hands dirty and just go try something new, even if it's not perfect.
These kinds of questions sort of lead me back to that space, Jenny and Thomas, where you talk about guilt. And one of the sort of places where self-righteous so manifests itself is our society's inability to accept guilt that they do not personally feel that they participated in. So when I sort of move into the world in the ways that you were just talking about it, Jenny, and I realize that I'm not clean in any of this, in any of the decisions I make, and then I have to, some sense, accept guilt for whatever self-motivation or whatever aggrandizement might be, even hidden from me, according to certain actions. That notion of accepting guilt becomes extremely difficult for a large segment of our population, which can't say, yes, we did this. And I think about that aphorism from Nietzsche that I'm going to butcher the translation, but memory says, I did this. Pride says, I could not have done this, and remains inexorable. Eventually, memory yields.
Mm.
So, when I look at that's a kind of a profound distillation of our inability to come to grips with the societies that we live in, that we participate in, and our complicity in the past, because we have not taken the means to tell the truth about it. So then we end up in a situation where we're going to ban critical race theory from the schools, or we're going to pass a law to make sure that we never have to ever hear about Tulsa Race Massacre. We're going to make sure that we erase these things from our memory so that we cannot say that we did that.
I mean, that's why I think, Bonhoeffer's emphasis on the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus's commands as practices, as ongoing practices, that if we are continuously practicing certain things, like the things in Matthew 25, visit the prisoner, then you're always putting yourself in a situation in which your own complicity is laid bare. And so the idea about memory, it's not a memory, it's like it's what you're doing right now. And I mean, just one quick thing that might be helpful, I was just thinking about a very concrete example of the ways in which we might think of ourselves as guilty going to the prison. I think Thomas has this more than me because he has like a key, right? So he can walk into the prison and open gates and walk through to get to where he needs to be. And as we're walking out and he has a key, sometimes someone wants to come through and he has to say, I'm sorry. And he shuts the gate and locks the gate. Like, who is he? Who are we being in that moment? I mean, that's like such an obvious, concrete way in which we're complicit and messy, and so I think that all of this is about discipleship. It's about the ongoing, not in our heads, it's not our belief system, it's about actually following Jesus, actually putting into practice. We can't be engaged in every issue, but being engaged in the places where we feel called and really going deep and being engaged is the only way. It's about, otherwise we escape into, our political ideologies or religious ideologies, but it's about feet on the ground, Yeah.
Okay. So there's one more question. Then I definitely want to hear other examples of incarceration systems and practical things we could advocate for and such, or ways communities can connect and serve and such. This is from a different Jenny, who's a therapist, asking the other Jenny about, and there's a long way of framing the question, but in the essay on page 116, you get this line where Bonhoeffer says, humankind's being as God, after all, includes precisely its not wanting to be a creature. God alone can address humankind in a different way. That is, God alone can address humankind with regard to its creatureliness that can never be abrogated. And in the conversation that set up the question, this is referencing back to, she had been in a previous group where we read 3 Charles Taylor books, and the ethics of authenticity and the secular age and this kind of thing. And she said, and so often in my work as a counselor, we have to assume that the individual is the expert of who they are.
Yes.
And they get to set the own terms of their identity. And often we're challenged. I think she's referring to the rest of the field, like psychologists. If we are, it's problematized to challenge their own self-understanding. And currently there's a growth of language of of harm used to people when you don't recognize whatever self-identification a person identifies as, either events of trauma and victimhood, and you may, as a therapist, think, but you're more than that, and this kind of thing, and there's tension, or like sexual identity type things, or all the way down to where you locate yourself in a political question. And she gives a number of examples, but then wonders what do you advise, both for like clergy, she imagines having this problem, but also people in other helping professions, when the cultural norms of self-identity have this kind of authenticity there, where in a sense the ethics of authenticity, she said, sounds like the ethics of not wanting to be a creature. Does that make sense? Like this, that if God alone can address humankind as in their creatureliness, and now we've gotten to a point where the only one with access to who you really are, your authentic self, is you, then you get in this deep tension as both ministers proclaiming the gospel, but also those in a helping profession talking to an individual.
Yeah. Well, interesting. So for, I mean, you know, when Bonhoeffer uses some of that language, God alone, I never am quite there with him. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I think he's talking in a very sort of, he's not talking about individuals. He's talking about sort of humanity in these broad ways. So I wouldn't think that particular passage would apply, but I should also say that Bonhoeffer has a lot of critiques of psychology because of his father that I do not share, and I think that he could have maybe been helped a little by integrating some psychological insights into his theology. So I don't see, I think that I was saying, like, yes, when you were reading it first, to the importance of people being experts on their own lives. And I think that, and also just real quick, you know, we can always read an author against themselves. And when Bonhoeffer's written 10,000 pages, there's enough material that you can read some of his stuff against himself. So I would say that, that even if he wouldn't go in this direction, I think something's happening.
Oh, my phone is off. Sorry.
I would say that way of thinking of a person's being experts on their own lives. I mean, of course, we would also want to say sort of in community, you know, that we still need the insights of other people, as long as they're respecting that we are the experts on our own lives. I think that is very much in line with a lot of his theology against domination and about respecting limits. It might not be what Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself would say if he was right here and right now, but I think the thrust of his theology, there's enough to affirm that is what it means to be a creature.
It's so, like, in some sense, the way he's taking that text, right? Like he says at the beginning, this isn't an origin story. This is a description of the character of human existence. And so, like, part of the confusion you're suggesting is the text is talking about a person or two people, and it's more a description of the human situation.
Right. Yeah.
Because in Life Together and then later in Letters and Papers, he's rather emphatic about, like, the gospel doesn't go to a generic person, into a generic space. It actually goes into the particularities of one's life.
Mm-hmm.
And even next week, like the lecture everyone to get on Monday from Andy Root, like, in it involves telling stories about when he was a youth minister, and like how the very specific things, like a youth whose dog died, and how Bonhoeffer, like, joined the young teenager in the death of that, and that became the place where the event of the gospel happens. And
yes.
So, yeah, I get that reading against, or what the tension is, but I do like that challenge of, like, authenticity and how it functions in the present is pretty tricky.
I mean, he's a philosophical theologian trying to talk concretely. So he very much mostly sounds like a philosophical theologian.
Are you saying that we don't do that easily?
Can I know this is like, I'm neither a psychologist or a theologian, so I'm probably like wading into the wrong territory here, but I just,
I know, but you're married to one.
Yeah, right. So, I could just, but that, it just struck me that I mean, that idea of being experts on ourselves. I mean, I think, and to the person's question, I mean, it does seem like absolutely in line with this idea of creatureliness, not to kind of assume that we could have the pretense of thoroughly knowing or being an expert on another person. Of course, that seems like a limit, but I do wonder to what extent that also encourages us to have a practice of having that same kind of gentleness and limit with ourselves. I mean, I think of recognizing that if I'm a creature, that means that I also can't exhaustively know and define even my own being, and maybe in trying to do so, I'm also being severe with myself in a way that could, I mean, not in every case, but I think, of course, for people, a lot of the times, self-identification is a form of authenticity and resisting all these horrific ways that other people have defined you. But it can also become it could, in the right circumstances, also become a severe and dehumanizing thing, even for one's own self, I would think.
Yeah, and he does have some beautiful stuff about mystery, of the other person as a mystery. And I know because it was in what I like to call my wedding, which was actually our wedding, where we read some of those passages.
Jeff, you look like you're about to say something.
Nope.
Oh, okay. Well, so when it goes to the question, which was sent in, but also was in the chat around places or countries where there's a better model being implemented, when you think about incarceration, and there were emails from community leaders of different faith communities and such asking, are there kinds of connections that are beneficial for churches and faith communities to come alongside people and such? If people are if there are groups starting to take seriously this challenge, what are the kinds of things to advocate or invest in that are moving away from that kind of retributive framing?
I think that if you go really, no matter where you are in the country, I'm sure there are some groups locally who are doing some work around stuff like restorative justice. I mean, I know there are everything from schools to, here in Atlanta, the Georgia Justice Project is working on alternatives and diversion that focus on restorative justice instead of prison time and things like that. And I mean, the example, we drew a lot on her work in thinking through this essay even, but, Danielle Sored's work in Brooklyn with Common Justice. And of course, then there are all the people who've been thinking for a long time about transformative justice and community accountability. I think we mentioned some of them in the essay, but, people who just come to mind, like Miriam Kaba. There are a bunch of other people who are doing great work along those lines, and people who are thinking about the connections, not only between restorative justice, but of our models of justice to our entire social and political landscape. A lot of the people doing the work here in Atlanta and thinking about, I don't know, you guys probably have heard about Cop City coming up here. I mean, the people who are talking about that, a lot of them are very tuned into the ways that environmental justice is tied up part and parcel with how we treat other human beings. And I think that's a really important frontier in this. So that's kind of abstract, but so I'll just say, like, to more directly answer the question, I mean, there are countries that have more humane prison systems for sure. Like, I mean, I think Norway is often brought up as an example, or Germany is often used as an example. But these are still systems that are in many ways rooted in the same history as ours, and I think that also still do a lot of the same things that our system does. And I think that it's sort of, if you're going to really look for innovation in models of justice, you have to look to those local community organizations and the work they're trying out on the ground to hold people accountable in a way that actually promotes healing, rather than to prison systems in other countries, which are, like I said, in many ways defined by the same history that we so often, as Jeffrey was alluding to, now are encouraged to forget or deny or repress, but that is absolutely continuing to shape our present moment.
Awesome. Well, this has been a blast. Jeff, you got any closing questions or thoughts or anything?
No, I was the lecture and the essay in the book that we had mentioned before, and I think you had maybe put it out about what that book is. I think it's in paperback now.
Mm-hmm.
It's a collection of essays about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and political resistance. It just really started me thinking about where we are in America now, our inability to come to grips with our own guilt and accept it, because I didn't do that. That doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm not even going to teach it. I'm not even going to allow people to hear about it. The pandemic of self-righteousness, that I feel is corrosive to so much of our accepting one another as the Imago Dei, as the living image of God. It prevents us from it, and that's, I have to accept my guilt, because sometimes I behave poorly on Twitter, and I have to keep in mind, this person on the other end of this exchange is a human being, and a human being made in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm just going to stop there.
Jenny, Thomas, are there particular places you want to point people to if they want to follow you, catch up, know what's going on and such? Of course, on the class resource page, you'll see links to all of Jenny's books, and it's also in the email that you got earlier today.
I'll encourage people to check out the Georgia Coalition for Higher Education in Prison. I think Jenny mentions that work that I'm involved in and that a lot of others are doing here in Georgia. But I think, I'm less and less kind of like interested in doing scholarship but my focus has been more and more on kind of building that network and relationships of community partners here in Georgia to kind of support expanding college degree programs inside facilities, but also to get more schools actively taking responsibility for the neighborhoods and communities where they are and to which many people are coming home from our prison system. So that's where I would point people.
Well, you probably heard a shout out earlier for the International Bonhoeffer Society English language section, that every single person who is on this class is invited and welcome to either become a member or to be a friend. We have a great new website. Why am I forgetting the name of the website? Shoot. Bonhoeffersociety.org, I think is it. Please keep up there. If you are in Atlanta or Georgia, I'm at All Saints Episcopal Church in Midtown Atlanta. I'd love to meet you and continue the conversation. And thanks so much to Tripp and to Jeffrey both for hosting this.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, it's been fun.
The title of the book, I see somebody asking, it's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Theology and Political Resistance. Yep, there you go. A little backwards, but...
Well, yep. And you're correct. The website is, in fact, bonhoeffersociety.org. So thank you both for hanging out with us. Thank you for all of you that joined live. Definitely those who sent in all the exciting and challenging questions. We'll look forward to hanging out next week with Andrew Root. Those of you that are clergy, definitely make sure you send in your questions and such, because that it is the week that is specifically geared towards the rethinking the nature and challenge of faith in the present. And if you've sent questions about that we haven't talked to, resend them, because there's I'm going to have over 600 and some questions at this point. So I can go to the top of the list. Organizing them is quite a treat. Yeah. Anyway, it's been awesome. We'll talk to y'all later.
Thank you, Jenny and Thomas.
Bye.